Hello, everyone. I'm Germán Pellejero, co-founder of Scrum México, here in Oaxaca City. Today is Jorge Silva too, co-founder of 10 Pines, and Shane Priest, co-founder of Sociocracy 3.0. And we have this first interview. Maybe we will have another webinar more deeper on sociocracy. But the idea of this interview today is just to ask directly to James about sociocracy, about all this idea. We have questions in a template that we share in the invitation. If you have any other question, please put it on Q&A section in Zoom. Maybe we will see the extra question after before the interview. So maybe let's start. Jorge, you have the questions.
Okay.
And welcome everyone.
I'm going to be the interviewer. So, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to do this webinar. At least for me, it's a really big honor to know you in person and to talk with you and try to think together. So thank you. I know your agenda is really hot right now, so it's really yeah, I'm really grateful that you can separate the space for us. So since we were talking about sociocracy, Sociocracy 3.0 or S3 and all this world, I was thinking that one of the first questions that we can handle is to if you can tell us or explain what is the difference between all of these words. When we were talking about the webinar and organizing this, I mess it up with all the words sometimes. So I think it would be nice for all the people that is new here and all the people that maybe know something about sociocracy. What are the different ideas and what is S3? I'm going to say S3 instead of Sociocracy 3.0. I think it's okay. So I think it would be nice that you can explain what the differences are and what is in fact S3 and a little bit of the history, how you came up with that.
Sure. Okay. Well, hi everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you also, Carmen and Jorge, for making time and preparing for this opportunity as well. I'd just like to kind of bat back the compliment and the appreciation you shared for being here with me, because I just want to kind of confirm I'm just some guy, and like you were probably guys and women there on the other side of the call. And why that's relevant is that, you know, many years ago now, nearly 20 years ago, I was introduced to the concept of sociocracy. Back then, there was only a single web page in English that was describing the sociocratic circle method, actually. It was on a page on a co-housing website in the United States. I also was given a hand-typed document from Australia where somebody had heard word of mouth some of the ideas around sociocracy and had actually typed out this document. So we've come quite a long way since then. And back at that time, I was, I'd come from a kind of quite entrepreneurial background. I wasn't a successful entrepreneur, but I had the spirit of it at least. Around my mid-20s, I had a bit of a crisis of meaning. I felt like I needed to do something more valuable with my life. And so I started working with at-risk young people in the UK. They were at risk of social exclusion. And I was looking for a venue to work with some of these young people a year or so later. And I ended up inheriting a kind of residential center, like a business and a community of people who were living together in this intentional community, and their focus was on right relationship and personal and planetary transformation. It was kind of a bit of a hippie thing, you know. It was like quite alternative, and I was looking just for a venue actually to work with these kids, but I ended up getting involved with these guys. And what was interesting for me was that they were at war with each other. Literally, there was physical violence. People were really angry and upset. Trust had broken down, and this was as a result of 17 years of history that these people had together. So yeah, I was just kind of minding my own business and trying to find something meaningful. And I ended up inheriting the center from the owner who was leaving. And she said, well, could you please, maybe please bring everything that you're doing, the work you're doing. I was working a lot around conflict at the time, and interpersonal relations, and learn about nonviolent communication and sociocracy. And so just by one turn of events and another, that's led me to where I am today, because my underlying interest was about relationship, and about why it is as human beings we're so challenged. You know, it's like we for all of the joys that come from our relationships and the necessity of interacting and cooperating and collaborating together, it's really, really difficult to achieve that. And so part of my personal journey around understanding more about human conflict and human potential, and the fact that we collaborate to meet human needs, essentially led me down this path. And so, you know, I don't have a degree. I learned through the University of Life. I was just wanting to be in service somehow, and this series of events led me ultimately to developing Sociocracy 3.0. So, like, coming back to your question then, sociocracy in essence, if you look at the meaning of the word, and that's important to understand, it means rule by the social group. It's like the nearest correlation we have is democracy, which is rule by the demos. It's like rule by those with voting privilege. And so, you know, historically, it's it was a concept for government, actually, you know, on the state level, and based around the idea that in future we would need to take a more scientific and empirical approach to how we make and evolve agreements. And we would do well to kind of test hypotheses and move away from reliance on some kind of external authority to dictate to us how we should behave. Yeah, so there's a lot more about the history, which maybe I could go into at some point later in the call. I think it's relevant, but I'm saying this to understand the fundamental kind of underpinning mindset of sociocracy, about enabling people through collaboration to harness the greater potential than we could achieve alone. And to, in the case of people who are affected by decisions, to include people in making and evolving those decisions, so that there's more ownership and sense of agency over what's happening. So having said all that, then, like, coming to your question, what are the differences? Okay, so you've got sociocracy as this kind of concept, or some might say like a philosophy of how we could govern together. And then you've got the Sociocratic circle method, which was evolved from the late 60s, early 70s in the Netherlands by a guy called Gerard Edinburgh, who was wanting to bring some of the concepts of earlier thinkers around sociocracy into an organizational context. And he developed a methodology for handling governance in the system in a way that kind of decentralized somewhat the authority through the system and enabled people to kind of participate in making and evolving agreements in the system. And so that methodology has been around now for 50 years, I guess. It hasn't evolved so much actually from the 70s, I would say. And it only addresses governance. And so until the noughties, you know, like 2003, 2004, Sociocratic circle methods was largely only accessible if you spoke Dutch, and it was, most documentation was in Dutch. And then John Buck and Sharon Villines authored a book called We the People, which was only published in 2007. And Brian Robertson, who is the founder of Holacracy, developed Holacracy, was actually mentored by John Buck around 2005. And he was looking at what potential the Sociocratic circle method had in his organization at the time, a software development company that he had. And he felt that it was quite limited. He didn't enjoy the rigidity of it. He also thought that the people who were kind of championing that were not so much walking the talk in terms of some of what they were standing for, perhaps. And so he went on to develop Holacracy as a more whole system approach to organizations that also handled operations and so on. So these are really like until S3, these were the three main perspectives you could have on sociocracy. There was the methodology from Endenburg, there was the kind of philosophy for government, and then there was Brian Robertson's adaptation of Sociocratic circle method and the various pieces he added to it. So then finally, if we come to S3, I was teaching the Sociocratic circle method right up till 2014. I was quite a strong advocate for it. And in 2014, I met Bernard Bockelbrink. So he, myself, and Liliana David are the co-developers of S3. He's an Agile coach. He'd worked as a CTO. He had a lot of experience around Agile and Lean, and he's a real thinker. And he was a bit perplexed about this topic of scaling agility as necessary throughout an organization rather than just having agility at the level of product and service development. And when he came to a workshop of mine and discovered the Sociocratic circle method, he saw a lot of potential in that to answer that question, because there's quite a lot of Agile in the Sociocratic circle method, depending on how you apply it. So a question he asked me one day was whether, in my experience, I could think of examples of organizations that over time adopted the Sociocratic circle method and stayed true to that methodology. And the answer to that question was no, not at all, actually. And so he asked me what happened, and I said, well, in reality, what people do is they take of what they think works, they change things that don't, or they abandon things that don't, and they basically just synergize what they think has utility from the methodology into what they do, what else they do, all of the other experiences and background that they have. And that's essentially the foundational kind of perspective upon which we built S3, because we decided, let's take a look at these different methodologies and frameworks, and rather than pronounce to people what method or framework might be useful for them, we'd break it down into individual patterns and put together a menu of behavior patterns, if you like, that you can see present in these different methods and frameworks that people could pull from on the basis of need and according to their priorities. And so in that sense, S3 is really very different, because you can't really nail it down in terms of an ideology. I mean, there's principles that are important to it, but it's not leaning one way or the other. It's got relevance in just about every conceivable organizational context you could think of, that's more hierarchical or more decentralized. But the fundamental point of it is that it's a menu of these human behavior patterns that our ancestors have learned, often through more error, trial and more error than success, and over time found patterns that can help people to be successful in their collaboration in some way or other. And so what we decided to do was try to tell that story, to pass on these different patterns for people to consider. And in a moment when they realize that their current approach is inadequate to bring about the results they would expect or wish for, then there's access to this kind of generational wisdom that they can kind of check through and see if there are things that might be relevant and help them to move forward in terms of their objectives.
Great. Well, yeah. Well, I was thinking I interested in one of the principles that you have in S3. There is transparency, and lately I was really interested in that kind of ideas. How do you deal with transparency and information in different groups or in company? So I have a question between how do you deal with this tension between transparency and the confidentiality or the privacy of the people, because sometimes you have I suppose when you talk about sociocracy and collaboration, you need information in order to make better decisions or to make decisions, and if everyone is going to make decisions, you need information, right? So in your experience or in S3 in the approach in S3, do you have any pattern or any idea how to deal with information, and what happens when the privacy came up and you have to deal with this tension?
Sure. Well, if you look at it from the point of view of S3, there's a pattern in S3 called navigate via attention. And what that's inviting us to do is to pay attention when we perceive a situation that...
problem with the microphone. I don't know if that's
okay, let's try again.
Yeah, it's worked. Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Sorry.
So I was saying that in S3, there's a pattern called navigate by attention. And that basically invites us to pay attention when we experience some kind of inner alert. And the reason we experience an inner alert is because we're perceiving something that is different to what we expect or wish to see. Okay? And that's for all of us, all of the time. And if everything looks as we would expect it to, and we don't want for anything different, then generally we're quite unconscious and just happily going about our day being in the moment. So that's a useful asset to have. And when it comes to bring that specifically to your question, it's like when you perceive a situation where there's value or necessity in information being accessible to people, and it's not, then that would be an important, we would call it a driver to address. Okay, so, but on the other side, what you're saying is there's some instances where having information available would contravene some kind of confidentiality, some kind of security issue, and so on and so forth. And so if it's one way or the other, it's straightforward, right? Because we need the information, it's not available, how do we make it available? And if it's that information needs to be kept secure and within a certain context for certain people to see it only, then that's clear too. But when you bump into this situation where people need the information at the same time it's sensitive, then S3 is inviting that we apply common sense. And I appreciate common sense isn't so common, but what would you do in that situation? Yeah. If you were to describe the situation, it's basically some people need access to information, but it's sensitive and confidential. So we need to figure out what would be an appropriate way to provide access, you know, and you'd have to conduct some kind of inquiry about who should have access, what would be the implications of that, what steps you might need to take in order to be able to make that available, or deal with the fact that actually in this case it's untenable to share that information. So it's a very specific example, but if we zoom out a little bit, what I'm saying is that S3 doesn't provide you with an answer about how to deal with these things. What S3 is inviting is that you pay attention when these situations arise and seek to find a good enough way to address the situation. So that's one answer to your question. If I back out of that and come at it from a slightly different way, I'd like to add that transparency is really difficult in an organization.
Yeah, right.
You know, because it's not just about having information like somewhere that people can access, but it's also about having it in a form that people can understand, that they know where to find it, and that when information that is valuable for certain people arises somewhere in the system, that those other people who need to know about it do. Yeah, so you need some kind of way of notifying them. And in a small team, that's not so difficult, right? Because you can see each other. But when you're in a company of 100,000 people, that becomes much more difficult. And I don't think we have any kind of particular effective solutions to that at this point. I mean, software is helping. There are various tools that are being developed now that are enabling that to be more effective. But in general, I don't want to kind of paint the picture that that's a straightforward problem to solve. So it's a combination of common sense. It's a question of asking who needs information, and are there any implications with providing that information? And it's not about everybody needing to have access to all information all of the time. It's on a need to know basis, right? So there's this kind of radical egalitarian perspective that says all information should be accessible to everybody all of the time, and everybody should be involved in every decision in the organization. And that's a complete misunderstanding of Sociocracy and of S3, actually. Yeah, what we're aiming to do is free people up to be able to to be able to create value in the organization as autonomously as possible. So if information is required to enable people to do that, you're probably going to want to figure out how to make sure that information is accessible. This doesn't then lead to the conclusion that everybody needs to know about everything all of the time, because that's really not the case. We really want to grow networks of micro-organizations that are collaborating together with maximal autonomy and working together on dependencies when necessary to achieve a common objective.
Okay, so you are saying that S3, it doesn't mean that you have to be a full transparency space. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have an open book management or something like that. You can keep things separately each other and work fine.
Exactly. And the same for just about every aspect of S3 that there is you know, if what you're doing currently is good enough, then keep doing it and be grateful, because it won't last, but for now, good for you. You know, and when you bump into a particular situation where what you're doing and what you know isn't adequate to deal with that, then take a look and see what might work for you. But don't kind of assume that a particular pattern from S3 means you have to do things exactly like that. Or if you pull in a principle from S3, like transparency, for example, that suddenly everything has to be transparent. It's about what's fit for purpose, what's good enough and safe enough, and take a step, you know, try something, try to respond to the need as directly as possible, avoid waste, because you know, you've got enough to deal with already, and learn from your experiment.
So, and related to this somehow, there is right now like a buzzword that is horizontal, and you have a lot of horizontal flavors. and the question is, here is a question, and this reminds me something, is what is the relationship between horizontal or decentralized way of working or self-organized company and S3? I mean, you can work in a, I don't know, no bosses company, or you need to be a no bosses company in order to use S3. You can work with a hierarchy traditional company, or what is this relationship? What is needed and what is not?
Yeah, well, firstly to say, I think I said earlier, S3 is relevant in just about every conceivable context, or it's more correct to say there are patterns in S3 that will have relevance in every organizational context. In terms of this phrase, horizontal organization, I understand the spirit of it. Here in Europe, people talk about flat organizations as well. And to put it bluntly, I think it's a nonsense. You know, it's like there's no such thing as a flat organization, actually, because, you know, firstly, there's like micro hierarchies in systems. You've got hierarchies of competence, for example. You know, some people just know more than others. And if we're in a, Germán was saying about the earthquake in Mexico yesterday, right? If I was visiting Mexico and I'm staying with you, Germán, and there's an earthquake, I'm listening to you, right? I just want you to tell me what to do, because I've got no idea what to do with a major earthquake like that. In that sense, hierarchy is useful. And you also have hierarchies of accountability in an organization. You know, if you look at a traditional organization, if there's incompetence in the system somewhere, then in the worst case scenario, it's going to be the CEO who's going to resign from that company, right? There's a reason for that. It's because the buck stops there at that level in that particular context. And so decentralized, as you said, is a much more appropriate term, I think. And then you need to ask the question, well, what are we decentralizing? And what we're really talking about is power to influence. We're talking about decentralizing power throughout the system in a way that enables people to be able to maximally create value in response to whatever responsibilities that they have in the system. And so if you're in a company without bosses, as you said, it's like you're not in a company without bosses. You're just making everybody a boss in their own particular domain within the organization. You know, so you decentralize leadership. And sociocracy in general, the Sociocratic Circle method, holacracy, S3, all of them in some way are kind of inviting people to step into a position of leadership within a certain domain of authority within the organizational system. So self-organization, where we can self-organize more or less within the constraints of the organization and the constraints of whatever area of work we take responsibility for. And we can more or less influence things both within our own areas of work and throughout the organization. And so I think it's useful for people to get past this idea that everything should be decentralized, that nobody should have power or authority over another, and so on and so forth. It's more about asking the question again, what's fit for purpose? And when it's useful to have someone in a position of influence and leadership over others, great. But when it becomes wasteful or you're impeded by decision-making hierarchies and so on, then you want to decentralize further instead. And I think the last thing I'd say on this, just a little story. So Frederic Laloux's book came out a few years ago, and I think it was inevitable somebody was going to write something like that, and it was going to gain traction, because until that point there was, self-organization isn't a new concept, but in the mainstream there was still relatively few people who were looking outside of the box. And I think Frederic's book teased people into this possibility that there was another way of doing things, but it didn't really give anything concrete about how to go about achieving these things. It really gave a bunch of principles and this kind of ideal of the teal organization, which I also think is a bit of a nonsense, actually. It's like, you've got aspects of teal in an organization, but you might want to be orange in places too, or red in places too, and green in places too. But my point here was that started a movement, one of kind of pontificating intellectuals who proclaimed themselves to be teal integral thinkers and take some kind of messianic position about how organizations should evolve themselves. But beneath that, somehow, there was this kind of green layer of people who were really disenfranchised and hurt by these power over systems, and wanting somehow and excited by the idea that there was another way to do things. But what happened is they demonized power and hierarchy. Yeah, it's like it went too far the other way. It was like suddenly everything has to be flat. Everybody has to be equal, and it's like we're not equal as human beings. It's like in different contexts we have more or less power to influence. And sociocracy cherishes equivalence, which means equivalence of voice, because we are not equal, right? So you need to give power to something other than the individual, and sociocracy gives power to the argument. It asks us to at least be reasonable together instead. I think teal, if you take teal or integral, in its essence, what it's really inviting us towards is seeing the essential value in all different ways of doing things, different behaviors, different approaches, different perspectives, and so on, and giving us access to the essential value that lies in some of these often quite polarized ways of doing things, so that we can more consciously and intelligently determine what would be appropriate in which context. And sometimes hierarchy is going to be appropriate.
Okay, yeah, I think, as I work in St. Pines, we have like a non-hierarchical way of working, and we use consent as a way of making decisions, and we really have that idea of a flat organization. But I think that sometimes we have this misconception of equality and justice, right? That you have to find or you have to find ways of be like a fair trade, right? And not just an equalitarian treatment. And I think that this is important. And I don't know if you have a pattern or a value or something that helps that, and maybe we can or think, how do you deal with that in an S3 environment? I don't know if you have any tip, any I don't know, any practice or something that can help to understand more that idea, or I don't know, I think that sometimes with the words that we use, for example, horizontal, it's like communicating a different idea what is meant to work in a collaborative way, right? So, well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have any recommendation or something like that.
Yeah, and could you just maybe just summarize your question in a single sentence again? What it is that you're asking?
So, well, it will be if you have any tip in order to work in a team, the difference between equality and fairness.
Yeah, okay. Well, we make the distinction in S3 between the principle of equivalence,
okay.
Which what we mean by that is that people affected by decisions are able to make or influence those decisions on a basis of a reason to do so. Yeah, so if you think sociocracy ruled by the social group, that's not saying don't have a government entity that makes and evolves agreements to kind of govern the state. But if there are decisions being made that affect the people of the state, then those people should be able to influence those decisions when there's a reason to influence them. And essentially what we're talking about there is if a decision will or could lead to consequences we would prefer to avoid, or there's a worthwhile way to improve a decision or a particular activity and so on, then we really do well to listen to that. Yeah, and that's difficult to achieve at the state level, but on an organizational level or on a team level, what sociocracy is inviting is that you give supremacy to the argument rather than an individual. So you can be in a team where you've got nobody's leading particularly. You might decide to divide up areas of work and responsibility within the team. So I'll take care of this, you take care of that, and share any important constraints or considerations that either of us should be thinking about while we're doing that. And if you've got enough transparency, then in a moment when I behave in a way where you see that could lead to problems for us, the team, then you can bring that possible objection to me and to the team, and vice versa. So you can't take the principle of equivalence on its own, because if you just have equivalence and no way to determine what qualifies as a valid objection in a system, then the worst case, you're going to end up with consensus. And consensus is great when you can achieve it maybe, but it can also, one, really narrow your options. And the problem with consensus is anybody can block. Yeah, so the principle of consent says raise, seek out, and resolve objections to proposals, agreements, and activity in the system. And an objection is an argument that demonstrates that something will or could lead to consequences you want to avoid or a worthwhile way to improve it. So I think that's those two elements together are, with transparency as well, are really, really helpful combination for people.
So, since you were, sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Since you were talking about consent and consensus, can you summarize a little bit what consent is and what is an objection and how you can integrate the objection in the S3 model? Because I think consent is one of the main practices, and maybe for the people that doesn't know about S3 is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, if we frame it in the context of different approaches to decision making, at one end of the spectrum, you've got autocracy, which is basically power to influence, or supremacy, concentration of power to the individual or the small group. Another scenario that many are familiar with is majority decision making. So a lot of modern democracies are based on this idea of majority decision making. And so in a majority context, supremacy, the concentration of power, goes to the majority. It's useful and interesting to recognize where the majority opinion lies, but historically, new wisdom usually emerges into a system through the minority. So we have a bit of a problem with majority decision making, right? Because it's often the crazy person who challenges the consensus reality, and in the worst case, we hang them or imprison them or just remove them from our communities and so on. And then later we find out that actually the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around, And so so what consensus seeks to do is to consensus with unanimity. One, it seeks to extract the value that each person has to contribute, but the general objective is to arrive at mutual agreement. So people in consensus are seeking to find agreement, and you end up with a narrowing set of options, because you're going to have some people who are more insistent, persistent, articulate in putting forward their ideas, and others who are less, more inclined to concede to others. You'll get some who are happy to disrupt and upset people, and others who are more inclined to please, and so on. And anytime somebody blocks, when you're seeking consensus with unanimity, you've got a form of autocracy, because basically anyone can stop moving forwards at any time. And so this creates an enormous amount of energy needing to be invested into forming proposals, consulting, lobbying, trying to put everything in place that you possibly can before coming to considering that proposition to make sure that people are on board. Consent decision making flips it around, and it basically says, does anybody disagree? And not just disagree on the basis of an opinion or a preference, but the question is, does anyone have an argument for why what's being proposed would lead to consequences, or could lead to consequences that we would rather avoid, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way, worthwhile is a really important word here, way in which things could be improved. And so consent is inviting people to deliberately look for arguments for something isn't good enough and safe enough as it is. It's not just settling on mediocrity, because it says if you believe you've got an argument that shows a way to improve it, please speak up. We want to improve where we can. But if you don't see a reason why it's going to lead to consequences we'd rather avoid, and you don't see a worthwhile way to improve it, even if you've got preferences for doing it differently or other ideas about how to do it, could we just run with this so that we can actually get on and experiment with acting on this decision rather than spending the rest of our lives talking about it? And so it's kind of bringing the agile mindset to decision making, right? It's like, come up with a hypothesis, test it as fast as you can, and get feedback, right? And if your hypothesis looks a bit scrappy, if someone says, "Oh, that's not quite right," don't go out and kind of embarrass yourself with the customer. Adjust your hypothesis and then test it as soon as you possibly can. So it's inviting an iterative and incremental approach to decision making, where you try to arrive at a good enough, safe enough proposition in response to an issue that you're facing. You harness collective intelligence to see whether anybody can see reasons why that might not be good enough or ways to improve it. And in the absence of any more reasons not to go ahead with that, go ahead with it, because you're going to learn something and you can apply what you learn to how you improve.
I have a little comment or question is, how do you deal with, it looks like this approach is like a really analytic approach. You have to really think about what is an objection and try to understand in a logical way of the decision that you are making. How do you deal with feelings when you are making a decision? Because sometimes maybe you feel that it is not the right decision, but if you can have a really good objection, it's going to go away your feelings, or how do you deal with that? I don't know if it's clear enough.
Yeah, no, it's a clear question. So you're asking, what about feelings? What about intuition? Maybe you can't present a clear argument, but you just have a sense that maybe it's not the way to go. And
I think that the objection process or the integration process sometimes it's like a really hard process for an objection to go through, right? And to make a valid objection. So the idea is, what happens when I have a feeling, but I don't have a clear vision of the objection?
Yeah, I understand the question. Well, one thing to consider is that we are deliberately checking to see whether there's any reasons why we shouldn't go ahead with something in a particular way. So when somebody raises a possible objection, firstly, for a lot of people, objecting to things is dangerous. In the worst case, it gets you rejected by your species somehow. Yeah? Or we're taught not to object, we're taught not to argue, we're taught to shut up, to just get on with things, don't challenge other people, don't challenge authority, and blah, blah, blah. So when you integrate or adopt the principle of consent, we're saying turn that around on its head. The biggest crime when you're practicing the principle of consent is to not speak up when you believe you might have a possible objection. So that's thing number one. Secondly, it's easy to presume that when you start using terms like argument and testing arguments qualifies objections, to think that that's just a rational process. But if you forget consent decision making for a moment and you ask yourself, what do you do in a team when somebody says, I can't really nail it down right now, but there's something about what we're doing that doesn't quite feel right. Yeah. Now, maybe that's the member of the team who's always exaggerating, always making a big deal out of things, thinks that there's ghosts in the closet, that something bad's always going to happen. And historically speaking, bad things usually don't happen, and they're just a little bit paranoid about things, right? Well, that was going to be one side of the spectrum, and you're probably going to want to handle that a bit sensitively and say, interesting, okay, maybe let's kind of see. But on the other side, you might have the team psychic, who's, whenever they say, I've got a gut feeling about this, doesn't feel right, can't say why, then that's a good reason, right? That's a good reason, because you've got a kind of historical precedence, that particular individual being kind of intuitive. So it's not about you kind of demonstrate it in an empirical way here and now with the evidence that we have, and if not, screw you, that's not relevant, right? It's about using your common sense, considering context, and asking yourself, can I see how this argument reveals the potential for consequences that we would rather avoid? It's not even that it absolutely will, but maybe it would, and are we prepared to take the risk? And or is there some adjustment we can make to this proposition that would mitigate against that risk? So what's the probability versus cost in terms of argument as well, right? It's like, okay, well, this could happen, it's a 1 in 1,000 chance, but if it happens, it's fatal because it will mean the end of the company, right? Well, you might take that a lot more seriously than like a 1 in 2 chance of something happening, but it's easy to mitigate against the consequences if it comes up. It might be unfortunate, right? But you might be prepared to take the risk. So there's a number of different factors you have to think about. And once again, it's about coming back to common sense. The patterns are here just to guide you. It's like, it makes sense to consider whether a particular trajectory could lead to consequences you want to avoid, or it can be improved somehow. For sure, that's just common sense to do. But at the same time, you have to take account for the context, which includes the people, and consider arguments in the bigger picture of things, not just from a cold, steely, rationalist point of view.
Right. So there is a question here about the implementation of S3. I don't know if exists such a thing, because if this is like a collection of patterns or collection of behaviors, you can talk about an implementation of S3. You can say that a team can implement S3, and if so, the question is, how do you deal with the different people and the different maturity of people around the group, instead of, well, that's the question. How do you deal with the different maturity in a team when you have to implement S3? And I don't know if there is an implementation of S3 when you work with.
Yes. Okay. So there's two questions really. It's like, how do you get started with S3? Do you kind of implement it, so to speak? And how do you deal with different, well, you say levels of maturity, or you could say different developmental skills, backgrounds, experience among people?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the two questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of implementing S3, if you take S3 in its essence, it's this menu of patterns, and it's like a pull system, right? So, okay, we've got challenges around decision making. What's available in S3 for that? Well, there's clarify or describe organizational drivers, proposal forming, consent decision making, qualifying objections, blah blah blah. Yeah. So that's approximately how you're going to be using it. At the same time, there are a number of patterns in S3 that most people in most organizations who look to S3 to see what could help pull in. There's clarifying domains is a common pattern in S3, which is basically like just getting clear on who's responsible for what the areas of responsibility are in the organization, and starting to have a conscious dialogue about that between each other, and to see where dependencies are, what are the elephants in the room that your current distribution fails to address effectively, and blah, 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 blah. Patterns for organizing work, you can just take straight out of the book of Agile for that, patterns like daily stand-ups and visualizing work, prioritize backlogs and so on. Patterns for making evolving agreements, those are also extremely useful. And then some building organization patterns and structural patterns. So there's a bunch of stuff that's going to be useful. So there are a lot of cases where people pull in several patterns from S3, let's put it like that. In terms of different levels.
So you can, it is different from Holacracy, where in Holacracy it's like you have to take it all or nothing. Here you can take some patterns or some ideas, and you are like working with S3. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, there's no such thing as an S3 organization or an S3 implementation. You're pulling in patterns, and that's good and bad news, right? Because on the one hand, that's great because you can just pull in what's useful for you. But then on the other hand, the question is, well, where do we start and what's useful?
Yeah.
So it requires some kind of investment in learning about that. Just as an interesting aside here, Auguste Comte was a sociologist. He was the first sociologist. He coined the term sociology, I think. And he also coined the term sociocracy in 1851. And following him about 30 years later was Lester Frank Ward, who was also a sociologist. And he was he was building on Comte's ideas. Comte said in future, we need this more kind of scientific approach to government, and we need a way to include people more in the decision-making so they feel more ownership over it. And these would be essential elements in a successful state of the future. And Lester Frank Ward took it further, and he said, we need to invest in the education of the people to a much higher level so that we can evolve our systems of government around the world, right? He said, and if you look back at that time, like there was an investment in quite the opposite. Yeah, it was like a dumbing down of the masses to prepare people to take their place within the system. So I think that was quite prophetic of him, because if you look ahead to today, I think he's exactly right. It's like, I often hear the complaint, well, that's a lot of work. It's like we don't have the time for the training or to invest in the learning and da-da-da-da-da. It's like, how do you think you're going to figure out a different way of doing things without investing effort in, one, unlearning the habitual ways you've been doing it until now when they're no longer good enough, and secondly, doing the hard work you're going to need to do to kind of integrate new ways of doing things and habitualize them into your system. Yeah. So coming back to your question around different levels of maturity or different levels of development, I mean, number one, if you've contracted with people to come into your organization with different levels of maturity and experience, then hopefully you did that consciously to start with, right? Because that's the first point at which we have a choice, is at that moment when we choose who we'll collaborate with. Yeah. So I think people often underestimate and fail to give adequate attention to that contract that's made at that point. And so sometimes you end up with people that rather you weren't with, for various reasons. But assuming that you see potential in people and there's a good reason for employing somebody into your organization in some way, and there's different levels of development and maturity, number one, you want to be making sure that you're mixing people up so people can be learning from each other. Yeah. So having a buddy, having a mentor system, swapping that around so people get exposure to different people in different moments. Supporting people to step into areas of responsibility where they don't have the competence, but they're supported so that they can skill up and develop. Putting older people with younger people so that you get the wisdom of the years with the innovation and the open-mindedness of the youthful, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing I would say. It can be a benefit, because you're going to have a much more kind of liberal minds in the younger people than in some of the older people, for example. So the other thing, though, is be transparent about it. If there's different kind of competencies within a team, and you're having those conversations already, how do we support each other to learn and grow? Then that's not going to be a big surprise, When someone says, "Hey, James, actually, mate, you're not so great at talking with people. You could really do with building your communication skills, and plus these 20,000 other things that you need to work on." I'm already going to know about that because it's going to be transparent in the system. And the other thing is that it's really important when you're looking at change that people understand the reason for change. Yeah, my son's 9 years old, so he hasn't got much experience in the world. He's really smart, and has quite a sense of entitlement. But if he understands the reason why it's worth his while to invest in something different, including learning something new, then he's right on board with it. And I think that's the same for all of us. It's not like change is difficult. Everybody's willing to consider change when it serves their purposes somehow, and there's not a deeper reason to stay the same in some way. And so S3, inviting people to identify areas of need where the current approach is inadequate to bring about the results you need, and prioritize those needs, and then start at the top and see what patterns you could bring in that might help you to resolve that issue. And so if you've got people at different levels of maturity, different competences, backgrounds, and experiences in a context where you need to bring about some kind of change, and you're transparent about the difference in competence and experience, and you're transparent about the need, and people understand the need, then you're going to be in an optimal position to have everybody on board to respond to it. And you're going to do the best you can with what you've got.
Right. So I have, related to this, I have a question about implementation or example in companies. Do you have an example of how a company can perform better using S3 than in a traditional way of management? For example, I know there is a lot of examples of how there is a correlation between performance and organizational health or psychological safety. Do you have any example that you have implemented that the company is better now than before using S3? Can you tell us an example? Yeah, sure. Right.
Yeah, sure. So I won't name any names, but I can set some kind of context around different organizations. So firstly, I think it's interesting to note that the majority of organizations that we've worked with directly have been around the kind of 30 to 300 mark in terms of numbers. And that's not to say that S3 patterns aren't being pulled in much larger organizations, because they are and have been for many years in different ways. But because of the nature of S3 and this idea of pulling in patterns rather than implementing S3, you don't have examples like the kind of famous Zappos example with holacracy a few years ago, as one example. So part of what we've observed over the last 6 years or so has been this tendency towards certain patterns that are useful most of the time. And so some of those that make most sense to people are integrating consent decision-making into the system, responding to organizational drivers and describing organizational drivers. Drivers is a key concept from S3. It's basically the answer to the question why, or a driver is the motive for responding to a situation. So just bringing in that concept helps people to start to have a conversation about why they're doing things. And it also helps people to recognize how we perceive things very differently sometimes. You know? So you see a situation and I see a situation, and when we start talking about it, we realize that we're seeing the situation differently, and we might have different ideas about what's needed as well. So describing organizational drivers is a generic in just about every organizational context that people have been pulling S3 in. Consent decision-making in its simplest form, actually, you don't even have to understand the process. It's just asking the question, does anyone have objections? I spoke to a guy who said the most profound takeaway he had from a 3-day program with us was when he left, he stopped asking people if they agreed and asked them whether they had objections instead. And he said it just like changed his life in every conceivable context.
Yeah, it's a powerful.
I was speaking, oh, yeah, artful participation. You know, there was one customer. So artful participation is it's really a guideline. It's framed by a question. And we can ask ourselves the question anytime: is my behavior in this moment the greatest contribution I can make to the effectiveness of this collaboration? Yeah, so it's a moment for self-reflection and considering how we're showing up. And if we see that an adjustment might be helpful, then we can adjust how we behave. Or we could ask someone else, hey, what do you think? Do you think there's any changes I could make? And so on. So one particular customer we went to visit, and we introduced S3 to a few people there, but most people didn't know what it was yet. But in all of their meeting rooms, they had artful participation on the wall, like the pattern. And this question: is my behavior in this the greatest contribution I can make to the effectiveness of this collaboration? And they were explaining that every meeting that took place since they put those posters up, people were in a radically different kind of mindset and were much more self-reflective and restrained, because nobody had explained to them anything about what that pattern was about, but everybody was self-reflecting and asking themselves this question. Right, so these are some specific examples. There's a personal favorite of mine. Well, I'll give a couple. So one of them was a company where they were a small company, I think like 12, something like this. And they were developing software, and they were flat, and they weren't so organized and effective. And so they clarified a few domains and they distributed the work. And at one point they decided that they were going to create a role in the company and call it CEO, right? So they defined the domain for a CEO, and they selected one of the organization to become CEO of the company. And so that person, they didn't take on the legal responsibilities, because the way the company was set up, that was sort of distributed among a few people. But the CEO took on responsibility for a number of decisions. And one of the constraints was you can't act on any of those decisions in the face of objections from anybody in the organization. And if we decide to fire you again, then we can just remove you from the role of CEO. So you had a CEO who was kind of employed by the people. Yeah. Another example of that, where in a hierarchical context, where a senior manager flipped the system to a more bottom-archical context. That's not a term, bottom-archy, but I really like it because it kind of gives you that idea of a bottom-up system. He went back to his department of 125 people. This is in, I can mention the company, it's KBC. It's the most kind of conservative bank in Belgium. He came to an S3 training several years ago, and he went back to his department and he told everybody, we're going to move from teams to circles, which means team members are going to take responsibility for governance decision-making within the teams. The managers will still be involved in the decision-making, but they'll do it as part of the circle now. So it'll be a collaborative process instead of managed teams. We're going to create a delegate circle, which is like it's a group of representatives from different teams who come together to make and evolve agreements on behalf of those different teams. So if you think like a management team would make evolve agreements on behalf of these different teams, it kind of flips it around, and representatives from the teams come to do to make those decisions instead. And he said, we're going to have a kind of staggered 3-monthly selection process for members of the team to select whoever they want to be a representative in that delegate circle. And in the first instance, 90% of the people who were selected were the managers. kind of made sense. They were used to managing the department. But 3 months later, 70% was selected, and then 6 months later, 50%, and 9 months later, only 30% of the representatives were managers now. And so you ask the question, well, what kind of happened to the managers? Because they're in a conservative bank, they're contracted, they're not going to become non-managers just because, you know, practically speaking, they're not involved in that anymore. So, and what was interesting was they went back to doing technical work, which was really nourishing for them, and mentoring people on how to take more responsibility for organizational management. What other examples can I give you? Okay, well, this is an example that goes back to 2012. So this was pre-S3. I was teaching the Sociocratic circle method, which I wouldn't do these days because I think it's too kind of rigid in a way. But
do you
at the
think
time, that was the best.
the Sociocratic way is rigid?
I think the methodology is quite limited. Yeah. I mean, for those of you who don't know, there's 4 basic principles. Okay, you organize in circles. So, like in that example I just gave you, if you've got a managed team, then you shift from that approach to decision making to a collaborative approach to decision making within the team. You double link between up and down the system. So if I'm in an operational team and you're my manager, for example, then our team would select a representative to also participate in decision making within the management team. You select people to roles on the basis of consent, and you make and evolve agreements by consent. So you bring in the objection pattern. Sociocratic circle method doesn't have a way of qualifying objections. So if you say you have an objection and insist that it is, then it is. And I think that's a problem because in the worst case, that can tilt back towards consensus again. And so this is why we added the qualify objections pattern to S3. That's it in a nutshell. That's the Sociocratic circle method. So you've got one organizational structure, double linked hierarchy, the same in holacracy, the decision-making process, the selection process, and the concept of circle. That's not relevant in all cases all of the time. You know, a double linked hierarchy might not be the best pattern. It might be wasteful to double link between all domains anyway. If you've got a more bottom-archic system, then often you don't need to double link both ways. An organization might have others of making evolving agreements for now and not be ready to introduce consent into the system and so on and so forth. So if you go with the kind of original idea around the Sociocratic circle method, it was a bit like holacracy. You have to do a whole system implementation. It won't work without it. And if you compromise a part, you'll run into problems. As we move forward, people are realizing that regardless of that claim, life's much more complex than that. And people take things like holacracy and SCM and extract the bits that they think are useful, for better or worse, right? It's not always that that's a correct decision, but nonetheless, you have to respect the fact that people do that. So for all of these reasons, I have moved away from SCM. And the other reason is because it doesn't cover operations. It's like it doesn't cover how you kind of enable co-creation in organizations and so on and so forth. There's all of the patterns for organizing work and so on are just not included.
So you were about to tell us another example?
Yeah, so this was an example from Ericsson. So some years ago, when I was first getting involved in the corporate sector and I was teaching Sociocratic circle method, I was in Sweden and I got invited by a colleague of mine to visit Ericsson and just to do an introduction on the Sociocratic circle method. And he was explaining to me that in 2008, he'd been in Ericsson with a colleague of his. They were both Agile coaches. And they were running a program to train Agile coaches in an office in Ericsson in Stockholm. And at some point, there was a change in management somewhere around that department. And the program was abandoned, right? Like can often happen. And so my colleague had to leave. But the people that they'd been interacting with were so engaged around the idea of a more agile approach to development in the company, that they kept the contact. And so they kind of started a movement within Ericsson. Anyway, over the years, that was more or less easy, you know, because there was various impediments to agile principles sort of rolling out more in the system. And over the years, several of those people left, actually, but a few of them stayed. So in 2012 and 2013, I was invited back in there. And then I ran some meetups in Stockholm. And by the time I'd launched S3 with Bernard in 2015, early 2015, there was quite a lot of people who are much more familiar now with Sociocracy. And then we had people from Ericsson come to S3 courses that we ran there and so on. So there was never any sort of formal adoption. I think we did a dinner talk once for some senior management there and so on. But why I'm telling the story was last year in October, I was at the Agile People Conference in Sweden. And I saw a guy there that I knew. He was one of the diehards. He was still there at Ericsson after all this time. And he was one of those guys who'd been in this Agile coaching program. And I asked him, how's things going today? And he said, oh, it's so fantastic. He said, I've been managing a department now for like, I think it was 18 months, something like this. And he said, it's great. I don't have to do anything. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, everybody just gets on with things. He said, it's been fantastic. You know, it's like all of those things we were learning and really struggled to integrate. Now they're so integrated into the culture here. And he said, in fact, I'm leaving the department in a month's time because I'm going to another department that's much more clunky. And they've asked me to integrate the same approach there. And that for me was really, what's the word? It was reassuring and affirming somehow, you know, because I've said to people for many years, listen, if you really enjoy banging your head against a closed door most of the time, you know, and all of your efforts over many years perhaps could be completely dismantled in a moment by somebody in authority who just comes and takes the wheel and turns that big ship you've been trying to steer in a different direction all of those years back in the direction again. And you're willing to do that, then thanks a lot, because we really need people like you. But if you would rather find some vicious, entrepreneurial, creative, innovative startup with people who are really progressive and really want to find new ways of doing things, then there's plenty of opportunities for that too, you know. So kind of think about how you're going to spend your short, precious lifetime. And this is what I see, you know, in terms of real world applications of S3. There's people in large systems who are pulling in patterns and then making small changes. And, you know, if you're doing that, evidence it, you know, show the value of it, demonstrate how it brings added value for the company, because that's going to, over time, support people to see the value, like happened in Ericsson. And on the other hand, you know, if you would rather just get together with a bunch of people and experiment and try out all these, they're old ways of working, right? They're not really new ways of working. They're just common sense ways of working. But to try those out with people, then go for it. And I'm seeing both in terms of S3 implementations. You know, examples of companies where the management were really opposed. There was a great story. The management really opposed to S3. A team decided to go ahead with it anyway. And then one day the CEO was at a conference and somebody came up to the CEO and said, I'm so impressed with your team. They're doing such amazing things, such a wonderful job. So happy to be collaborating with you. And this manager was really embarrassed. This CEO was really embarrassed because he had no idea, you know. And suddenly he was really pro S3, right? So you never quite know where it's going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice story. Yeah. So you mentioned recently about firing the CEO, and when I talk about campaigns, there is always a typical question that is how do you fire people when you have this collaboration method of making decision. So my question, since you talk about firing, my question is there any mechanism or pattern where you can fire people but in a more human and organic way with S3? Or how do you deal with that kind of,
Yeah, well, there's a few patterns in S3 that are going to be relevant in that context. I think the first one that's really important and often overlooked is a pattern we call contract for successful collaboration. And that primarily in the way we've written the narrative around that till now is relating to legal contracts with people outside of the organization. But there's more to it than that, because it's any time an agreement is made between two parties. And when you hire somebody into an organization, you're making a contract with them and you're making an agreement. And a good question to ask is, like, how do you kind of co-create that agreement together so that expectations are clear? On what terms are you inviting somebody into the organization? On what terms is somebody accepting to come into the organization? What are the expectations? Is it possible to have a probationary period? It depends where you are. Some places that makes sense, some places it doesn't make sense. But having as much clarity in terms of the agreement you make at the start is really helpful, because then it comes to a moment when it's necessary to fire somebody. Then that should make contextual sense, right? On the basis of the agreement that you've made. The problem I see most people in organizations face today is that those contracts weren't made clearly and explicitly to start with. And so retrospectively, there's this realization that you want to let somebody go, and it's uncomfortable, it's difficult, they feel disappointed maybe, or betrayed, and so on and so forth. So being clear about expectations from the beginning is really important. And I think we could all learn a lot about how to do that. It's like when you get married, you know, it's like you want to, that's a serious commitment, you know, and you want to make that really explicit with whomever it is you're agreeing with. You don't want any surprises later, you know. It's like, oh, well, I thought it was all right to kind of sleep with someone else if it's a relative of yours, you know. It's like, that's not going to be cool in many cases. Yeah. So I was contacted a couple of years ago by a customer who said, look, we've got this ethical issue because there's somebody that we contracted. We really thought she had potential to step up and take more responsibility, but actually she hasn't been able to, and we're constantly having to kind of fill in the gap, you know. She'd had every opportunity to improve and couldn't. And so my first question is, well, actually, she hadn't had every opportunity to improve. That was my first question. What have you done to support her develop? And they'd done some things, but not so much. And they'd felt uncomfortable to have honest conversations frequently about this person's lack of competence in that particular area. And so after 2 years now, it was all one big surprise for this person. And the other realization was that there wasn't really a contract to start with. It wasn't, you know, potentially you could proceed in this direction with these opportunities, depending on your demonstration of developing in this area and achieving this and so on and so forth. Yeah. So the takeaway that this customer had was that the accountability needs to be shared in that case. And they needed to have an honest conversation and show their appreciation for their lack of foresight around this, and where they'd failed this person, you know, because they've been much clearer to start with, and so this person wouldn't have had the unrealistic expectations that they have. And another example that I think is helpful in this question was, there was a company in Sweden again, who in Sweden you can have a 6-month probationary period. So they were hiring developers predominantly, and after 6 months they would have the conversation, should we keep the developer or not? And some people would sometimes say, yeah, let's keep James. And other people would say, get rid of him. He's a disaster. You know, we don't want this guy. And so that was really uncomfortable. And so they kind of asked the question, how can we get around this problem? And so they introduced a pattern from S3, peer review. And basically they gave a buddy to the person. So when somebody joined, they got a mentor for the 6 months. They clarified the domain, so it was clear what the responsibilities were. And then after 2 weeks, that person invited people with a significant contribution to give feedback on appreciations and improvement suggestions for how they could improve. And every month thereafter, there was a peer review with this round of appreciations and improvement suggestions, including the person who was responsible for the role. And then they would build a development plan about next steps for the next month of how that person would integrate that feedback and develop. At 5.5 months after the last peer review, everybody knew whether that person was going to stay in the organization or not, because you know, there was transparency around the conversation. People knew for themselves that there was there was a reason why perhaps they weren't going to be suitable for that particular role or suitable to stay in the organization. It doesn't mean to say it's like, it's not, it's always easy still, right? But it's kind of real, and it's transparent, and it's honest, and people know what to expect.
Yeah, and it's a way to face the problem and not to run away from the problems, right? I mean, if you start having this kind of problem, I think it's going to happen a lot of times. So it's time to face that kind of problem.
Yeah.
So, well, I have one of the last questions. That will be, what do you think are the challenges for the next few years in the S3 community? I think, and I know you are currently working on something, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, you know, this COVID-19 situation has been really difficult for everybody in different ways. And I feel very grateful, actually, and privileged, because it impacted me economically speaking, because I usually travel to, I deliver courses around the world and go to customers. So it was tempting to make a pivot towards offering online services. But Liliana David, the co-developer of S3, is also my wife. So we were kind of locked in together here. We decided to take the opportunity to work on resource development, because when Bernard and I first put S3 together, and Lily joined soon after, our intention was to provide all of the learning resources for free. And we do that still to this day, and we share them under a Creative Commons license, because, you know, the technology was there before S3, actually. We kind of just found these patterns and put them together in a form that people could access. And we think it's really important that those patterns can spread as far and wide as possible. But it's not so straightforward to thoroughly describe 74 patterns to the point that people can learn about them for themselves and use them. And so there's been this kind of bottleneck the last years, and a dependency on us being present with people to kind of, you know, like some of the questions you're asking now, it's like, you can't go and read that somewhere, right? So that's not cool. That creates a dependency on us. So we decided that we would focus on resource development during this time. And so what we're doing right now, so that's one of the challenges, right? How does it scale? How do you ensure you preserve quality and integrity of something that's open source and anybody can take it and use it and share it, right? Well, one way is you develop enough resources that people can go and find out for themselves what it is and what it isn't, you know? So that's going to help to eliminate people going out there and telling false stories or misleading people and so on. So what we're working on is an e-learning series. And in the simplest form, that will basically be an opportunity for people to engage with videos, exercises, and so on, to learn all the basics about S3. So we're decanting all of our learning over the last years and putting that into e-learning. We're developing a supported version around that as well, for people who want to go deeper and evidence their learning for themselves, and also maybe to us and others as well. We're going to then make a pivot towards more workshop-based training, so that people who've done that preparatory work already can come to those kind of environments and practice and apply learning in practice. So that's one thing, and I'm really excited about that, because I think about a year from now, we should have a really, really thorough offer, and by September, we should have the foundations program up and so on and so forth. Right. So that's great. The other things that we're working on, though, is in September, we're launching a beta version of an online learning community. There's thousands of people using S3 around the world, many more than I'm aware of. And I'm not really a social media person, generally speaking, you know, and it's really difficult to stay in touch with people at that kind of scale. So we're going to create a dedicated community with a free version, a paid version, and a professional version. And basically what that will look like in future is that practitioners who want to go a bit deeper, be part of calls like this, for example, access various opportunities within the community can join up there. Anyone using S3 can jump on and become a member there. And for professionals who want to go deeper, meet peers, have intervision and share learning to help others learn about S3, then there's going to be a place for them as well. And excitingly, we've also got a software that wasn't developed by us, but by another organization who we're just in the process of agreeing now to create a branded version for S3, which is going to provide all of the kind of basic features that would be needed for things like organizational kind of mapping, visualizing organization, visualizing work and governance, meeting management, navigate via attention, you know, so like a central nervous system, so that people, like the nerve endings of the system, can flow information through the system to where it needs to go, and so on. And we've also got a framework that we're going to be launching in the next weeks as well, which we're also testing right now, which is really, it's kind of like a framework of principles, if you like, but for sense making, you know, so people can take a look at the framework and things like focus on delivering value, right? That would be one of the principles for the framework. Or be clear on purpose, evolve strategy, evolve culture, and so on and so forth. So it's really a sense-making tool for people to see what areas they're challenged in within the organization, and then on the back end of that, there'll be patterns, like the toolkit, you know, what patterns from S3 would be helpful for you to pull in to deal with these particular issues in your system. So I think that's going to be helpful for those people who are a bit overwhelmed by an open menu of 74 patterns and are looking for a bit more direction, because it's going to really help to narrow things down. So one of the biggest challenges we have right now is just getting all that going, because it's an awful lot suddenly.
Yeah.
But amazingly, it's really coming together, and I think that's going to be the challenge over the next years, is like enabling that community to happen in a way where more and more people can take more responsibility for S3, where we can develop enough resources and accessibility to those resources that people can largely educate themselves around the basics of S3, and connecting people together so that there's not this bottleneck and dependency on us all the time, so that we can really build a thriving community of peers who are learning together and sharing their experiences and their different levels of experience and backgrounds, to really enable everybody as maximally as possible to be able to get value out of these patterns in whatever context they're using.
So it's a lot of work. You have a lot of work in the future. That's good.
Yeah, and it's exciting, Jorge. It's really, in a way, it's not work. It's just it feels like a way of contributing something that's meaningful and valuable, and it excites me every day. So it's work and energizing at the same time.
So thank you very much for your time. Maybe you want to have a last word or advice or tip or something for all the audience, or maybe not.
Yeah, well, it's been strange, because I see you in the picture, and I see Germán, but I don't see everybody else. So firstly, just to acknowledge any of you out there still on the call, to say thank you very much for showing up today. And I suspect that you showed up because on some level these topics are important for you as well. And you know, it's a real privilege to work with this, because it tends to attract people who are really asking the question, how can I contribute towards a better tomorrow? How can I, in some small way, influence things in a manner that's going to help realize organizations more in the way that our hearts know are possible. So just to appreciate all of you for whatever it is that you're doing, and wherever you are in the world right now, to acknowledge the challenges of this time and the uncertainty of it. And we are definitely in a moment of global disruption, and I think we're going to see a lot of consequences to this that are hard to imagine yet, and they might not all be easy, but our challenge comes opportunity. And I want to share my concerns and my excitement about what's possible at this time, and to just acknowledge that there's a big movement of people right now who are standing up and considering what they can do to create a better tomorrow for the children that follow. So to acknowledge you all for that, yeah, and to say be in touch anytime. You're most welcome, any of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James and Jorge too. Just to let you know, for all the people, we will have a workshop in 3 weeks from now, an online workshop for free also. Please follow the Scrum Mexico and Tempain's channels, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, to know more about this workshop. And maybe in 1 or 2 weeks, we will get the subtitles of this interview, and we will upload to YouTube. We will let you know too. So I think that's all. Thank you very much again, James.
Okay.
Thank you, Jorge.
Okay. See you guys.
You too, guys. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.